Welcome back to another episode of the Upstack Podcast. Greg Moss, how are you, sir?
I just started smiling the minute you started talking.
I'm excited too.
It's one of my favorite places to be, Alex. You know that.
We've got an important conversation to get to today because, usually if you look at past episodes, or I guess listen to past episodes, typically we're viewing our field or industry from a more granular level, micro, if you will, talking to different experts and our now dear friends across a range of topics. Of course, data center, cloud, security, procurement, AI, you name it, it runs the gamut. But I think it's about time we took a 30,000 foot view and got a little macro. What do you think?
It's a great idea. Perfect direction. Excited to dive in.
Awesome. Well, let's take that broader view and let's train our lens, since we're both wearing glasses, on the seat at the head of the technology organization, the CTO. And this is actually an idea we've tossed around for quite a bit, and we are fortunate to have the perfect guest, but more on our guest momentarily. Frankly, as we know all too well, Greg, and we talk about in every episode of the Upstack Podcast, this landscape, this technology landscape we're operating in is shifting. And frankly, it's always changing. But I'm curious if the role of the CTO has changed. And if so, how? I know you're curious too. So we ask our listeners, let's join us as we take a deep dive into the evolution of what is very much a business critical role. And with its constant wave of challenges and, of course, opportunities, risks, rewards, doubts, expectations. I could go on with the parallelism, but I will not. I think we're obligated to quote our friends over at Gartner. They had a recent survey. It was actually cited in a CIO.com article where the survey issued earlier this year found that CTOs face innumerable challenges in their efforts to digitally transform their organizations, including culture, demonstrating the value of innovation, and of course, budget or funding. The survey also found that CTOs with more than 6 years tenure in their position are less likely to cite internal politics as an inhibitor to progress compared to those who have less years under their belt. Turns out tenure has its benefits.
We have enough politics in 2024, Alex.
Hey, it'll be the fall before we know it. But for now, as we prepare for our next journey, Greg, I feel like those are some important breadcrumbs or tidbits we can take with us. But luckily for us, we have the perfect guest, a seasoned veteran in the position who can give context to the data and provide some real-world examples and insights into the process. Please welcome to the show, Linda Lannen. Linda, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Happy to be here.
Thank you for standing by as we bantered a bit. Linda, you are the Chief Technology Officer for the global environmental consulting firm SWCA Environmental. And if I may go on, you have more than 20 years of experience in architectural, engineering, and the construction industry, taking on huge projects, including but not limited to wide area network migration and installing enterprise security programs. Our deep dive on your background showed that your experience spans not only industries such as telecommunications and food manufacturing, but you've got a lot of experience with our friends in the Fortune 500. So Linda, welcome to the show. We're glad you're here. Hopefully you were forewarned, because this is our inside the mind of the CTO. So you're a good sport, and hopefully you enjoy this experience. But we are thrilled to talk to you, and again, appreciate you making some time. We have our pre-show call, and we have a great time doing it. And you used the term when I was just asking a bit about your experience and your background. I think you referred to yourself as the accidental CTO, and very curious. What is it about your background? If you could walk us through that led you to this position at the head of the technology organization.
I kind of call it an accidental CTO because I didn't start out when I was 23 or whatever and say I'm going to be a CTO or I'm going to lead the technology organization for any kind of company. Actually had a degree in finance and actuarial science, and realized I didn't love doing the actuarial science piece of that. And so stepped back and took another shot at what my career might look like. And I happened upon a role after a few tries as a technical writer for a small marketing organization that worked primarily for technology clients, the largest of which was IBM. And so I got this job basically writing articles about how IBM reference customers used technology. It could have been, an AS400, or it could have been OS2 at the time, or it could have been, Lotus Notes or any of the other kind of things that IBM was selling at the time. The opportunity came about because the quote unquote IT guy at that organization quit kind of suddenly and leaving a vacancy that nobody knew how to fill. And so I raised my hand. I think that's kind of a theme throughout my career. I raised my hand and said, hey, if you guys help me learn or send me to a class, I will figure this out. And fortunately for me, they agreed. And that was the start to my technology career.
So a natural curiosity led you down the path to the role of CTO. I'm curious, does anyone start out their career wanting to be a CTO? Is that an ambition, I wonder?
I think that I have run into those folks. I remember, though, I was, I'm not wired this way, but I remember having a conversation with somebody early in my career where they had said, like, when they graduated from college, that they wanted to be, chief actuary at a company. And I thought, God, I'm not even sure I knew what an actuary was then. So, um, but and so they kind of made out a project plan for like what their career looked like, and God bless them, because they made that role probably by the time they were 45. So I think that there are folks who set out and say, I want to, they might not say, I want to be a CTO, but they might say, I want to, run the technology piece or be a CEO in a technology organization. I will say, I don't think that there is a standard definition for CIO, CTO. Now we see titles like Chief Digital Transformation Officer, Chief Digital Information Officer, and things like that out there. I sort of look at all of those roles pretty interchangeably because there's not a standard, and it really, sometimes you see a CTO report to a CIO, sometimes you see a CIO report to a CTO. There's not really a standard across industries that I've been able to um, understand about titles. So I use all of those kind of interchangeably.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot of the larger companies tend to have both titles, right? A lot of the smaller companies tend to have more of a CTO level role. What are, just curious before we kind of dive in here, what are the key differentiators between the two? Like, what are those standout roles of a CIO, CTO?
I think a CIO tends to be pretty internally focused, and I talk about like the stakeholders being employees or employee-facing technology. I think a CTO may or may not have the CIO in their realm, but also in internal technology. But it often includes client or client or customer-facing technology needs there. And then when you look at something like digital transformation, in that those kinds of terms, I think that they're a little bit more faddy, I will say. That's where I get into, does that person actually have responsibilities for keeping things alive, and kind of that utility model of IT, or is it really the person who's focused completely on change, and which would kind of be what their titles imply, but when I've seen it, I've also seen that yes, they're also responsible for both employee-facing technology as well as client and customer-facing technology.
Linda, what are your responsibilities today at a high level? How do those compare as we think about the evolution of the role? And there's evolution, there must be evolution in the role as there are in so many different roles in business today. I'm curious how responsibilities today, some of which it sounds like you just touched on, compared to, say, even 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, I think if I go back maybe longer, but probably 10 or maybe more years ago, right? And I say this kind of tongue in cheek, but the the CIO or the CTO was kind of the IT guy, right? And maybe it was the IT guy who'd been around forever or the longest, and they were still very technical. And I think now you need to be a business leader first who understands technology and is more of a translator or at least whisperer. Maybe I mean and I've used the term kind of geek whisperer, right? It's really about understanding it, but being a business leader first who can have those conversations with somebody in marketing about what they need, or somebody in human resources, and the chief people officer or the chief financial officer, and really understand what it is they're looking for and trying to help them solve a business problem with either data or technology. And I think it's important for us to talk about data as well, because we kind of pass that by sometimes. I think that today you see, for example, in my role, I'm responsible for that, the piece of kind of what I call the utility function, right? Which is when people just have the expectation that things run. You want to keep things up and running. It just needs to work. It's reliable. It's predictable. And it's that kind of, like I said, that's the utility model. I flip the switch, it just should work. Now, though, in addition to that, I'll say the second piece of that would be we want to make sure there's no security breaches. And often, not always, the CTO includes responsibility for information security, and my role does today. And so those are kind of the two pieces, right, that require you to be very solid and stable and maybe not change much. Then you throw things into it, which might be more client to project facing and things like leveraging data, and you say that goes more into the innovation side of things, where things need to change. We need to break things. We need to experiment. We need to try things out. And with innovation comes the need to have more tolerance and grace for failure in that whole product development space. And that can sometimes be hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around both areas being, quite frankly, equally important.
Would you say that, I mean, obviously technology in the last 2 decades has sped up exponentially. It's actually getting even busier right now. You throw AI into the mix and other things. How much has the role of innovation for a CTO or CIO changed from just a pure percentage, right? Maybe you spent 10% of your time a decade ago. Are you spending 20% of your time now focused on innovation because of this?
Oh, I think it's more than that. I think a decade ago it was probably 5 or 10%, and now it's probably somewhere between 30 and 50%.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, and that's where I think you have to not just get you've got kind of one side on the IT side with that reliability, but you've got to really take those risks on the product side and on the client side. Otherwise, you'll kind of be left behind, and your clients won't see you as being that innovative partner and coming up with solutions that help them run their businesses. In some ways, I don't think it's necessarily different in terms of overall business leadership, because I think that other parts of the business have had to do that. I reflect, there's a CEO I used to work for named Bob Euler, who was the retired chairman emeritus of MWH Global. And I remember when I was at MWH a long time ago, that we always had this piece about balancing growth, profit, and risk. And those, when we set out the company strategy, it was kind of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, right? Those were equally important. And so I reflect on that because I don't know that that's changed. I think we still, there might be some roles that are one or the other, more focused. For example, somebody who's focused um, on business development, client services, they're probably focused a lot more on growth. Somebody who's focused on M&A or other kinds of, maybe acquisitive or organic growth, they're clearly going to have an end piece there on the growth side. Somebody who's a VP of risk or the CFO is going to maybe, and CFOs of legal are going to have more of a risk tangent, but I think that, or risk focus, I should say. But I think when we look at overall, and this I think is true for technology, whatever your title is, we have to always be looking at all three of those pretty evenly.
So there's an equation in there somewhere. It seems like there's a balance that needs to be struck. You touched on reliability, stability, and security maybe a decade or two ago. Greg, as you touched on the rapid evolution of technology and the innovation that happens with it. Here comes the introduction of innovation, and it sounds like technology potentially becoming a value driver for a business, and that being part of the CTO's role to be the evangelist for technology and help the business not only run more efficiently, but stay ahead of the competition and provide maximum value to the customer or the client in the process. If we but go back to that idea of the balance, Linda, um, it seems like the CTO's dilemma, if you will, is balancing security and now innovation. What do you do to strike that right balance, understanding it might not be 50-50, as you just touched on some percentages there?
That's a good question. I think that in any given organization, there's always a bit of, at any given point in time, right? There's going to be a bigger focus or a lesser focus on certain things, and so um, I think trying to find the balance is really about having open conversations, not only with your boss and hopefully your boss is the CEO, but having those open conversations with other business leaders, whether it's the COO or the chief marketing officer, the chief people officer, to really understand, where are where are they thinking about, and maybe reminding them about, how we need to kind of balance these things. And when you do look at those two things in particular, information security and innovation, and how we need to pay attention to both of them simultaneously. Um, the CFO might always is probably going to always be looking more at information security than at innovation. But somebody who might be in marketing or chief product officer might be looking more at innovation. And so I think it really comes down to communication, making sure that you and your colleagues are on the same page and they're always going back to, okay, what's the company strategic plan? What's our company vision? What's our company 10-year plan look like, so that we can always make sure that we are leveraging the right people and the right priorities at the right time.
Years ago, there were many verticals, right? And you couldn't say that every company was a technology company. I think today you could probably say most companies are technology companies. Because of this, a shift in success, right? Everybody used to look at sales and say, if you don't have a good sales team, you're going to fail, right? And I feel like that's equally accurate for technology now. I feel like, based on what you're telling me, if you don't have a good technology team in place, your company could fail. Is that accurate?
I think it is. I think that you really there's those, again, if you look back at the two different kind of things you got to balance, right? The innovation piece and new product development. It's kind of like that is where you need to go with growth. There's only so much organic growth you can do without having to get into kind of new products and new services and listening to your clients on that realm. We have clients who are coming to us and asking us for help on data management. We're an environmental consulting firm. And I think that a lot of folks wouldn't have expected that conversation with a client a few years ago. So, you have to look at that from a risk perspective, from an innovation perspective, and looking at how can we help our clients solve their business problems. And so if you don't do that, you're not going to grow. And we've all heard the adages about, if you don't grow,
You die.
you're going to die, right? So I think that that's one piece of it. The other piece I would say is I see this in another organization where I have a number of friends who work, where there's a long time CIO who doesn't do anything around innovation, and they're very focused on kind of that utility model and it being inexpensive as a percentage of revenue for what they spend on technology, and it making sure there's no security breaches, making sure that stuff is really they don't even focus on does stuff work. It's really more, is it cheap and are there no security breaches, right? And so that's kind of how that CIO is appears to be being measured. But that means that they struggle with innovation because the organization has an entirely different now leader that they've hired that's not in the same part of the organization as the CIO, in order to focus more on innovation and new product development. And so you see that, and you see these two organizations that kind of sit side by side, but they don't really have a great relationship. And so it's interesting to see, how different organizations, react to that. But that doesn't feel like it's the right answer. It doesn't feel like if you've got two competing technology organizations that in the long run is going to be healthy.
Linda, when it comes to striking the balance, and you touched on open lines of communication, great alignment with different leaders throughout the organization to understand what their needs are and how technology might be able to support the accomplishment of those, delivering against those needs, but accomplishing their goals. Are there any best practices, guiding principles maybe you live by to ensure an organization or your organization at SWCA is striking the right balance?
That's a great question. Right. I think that, for a key that has worked for me is setting up, frequent calls on a certain rhythm with my peers and with people who, lead different parts of our organization. So, I have a weekly one-on-one with the CEO, who's my boss, and then I have a weekly one-on-one with our COO, right? He's kind of 80% of our organization. So that's important for us to connect weekly. And we, it's only a 25-minute meeting, and half the time we only go 10 minutes, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that we go that long, but it's a frequent check-in one-on-one about how can I help you? And, what's going on in your organization? Where can my team do better? What's something we haven't maybe thought of that we can help you with operations? I think maybe there's another lesson learned in there. I was in a meeting with an executive coach I know, and I had hired her to help my team with some kind of in the forming, storming, norming aspects after I had joined the organization. And I remember it struck me because when I met with her one-on-one after the call, she specifically used the phrase, "How can I serve you?" And it really, obviously, I remember it because it was like probably 2.5 years ago. And it stuck with me that as somebody who served clients, that was a really great way to get them to kind of step back and think about that. I ask whenever I have a meeting with one of my peers, what can I do to help? And people come to expect me to ask it because I've been asking them that question now for 3 years. But it's interesting to kind of hear people's responses to that. Occasionally I'll get, well, I don't think I have anything, but what can I do to help you? And then occasionally, most often I hear something, right? It's like, oh, can you help me with this? Or do you think that there's any way we could look at this other problem that we have? And really, at the end of the day, we are the technology consultants to our organization, and we need to be helping them with the business problems that they have. And I think that one of the things I try to stress with my team is making sure that our folks, regardless of their role in the organization, that they don't become kind of the order takers at McDonald's, right? That they're not just responding to what somebody asked for, and that they're really kind of on some of those digging in to say, well, what's the problem that you're trying to solve, and let's look at is there a different way to look at the data rather than me just saying, oh, I'm going to create a Power BI report that gives you these data points, let's back up and think about the data itself. Is this the right way to solve for that problem that you feel like that you're having? So really looking at that from that consultative perspective versus just responding to close a ticket. That's very transactional, and I don't want our relationships to be transactional.
Being a sounding board for your teammates, your colleagues, it sounds like that approach has proven quite valuable. But you also mentioned not being an order taker. Linda, I am curious how much of your role, let alone your organization's role, is that of technology evangelist. I'm sure there's those who embrace technology and are excited at the thought of the innovation, and rest assured there's others in an organization that think the status quo is okay. How often do you find yourself flying the technology flag and trying to get people to embrace new ways of doing things and leveraging technology to do so?
Oh, I would say that's for me. That's on a daily basis, right? There's services that we can deliver to our client projects. As an example, satellite data services is a good one, right? That we can uncover a lot of information pretty quickly and relatively inexpensively for our client projects if we use satellite data much more frequently. And that's just something that people not haven't necessarily embraced as much as we'd like. And so I'm frequently having that conversation with letting people know, like, hey, did you know that we can get satellite data for your project site and it would cost X amount, and that was really not that expensive for the client, and they, I think, would really benefit from it and see the value of it. And a lot of times people just aren't aware. And some of that is due to just sort of the size of our organization, how quickly things are moving, and just lack of awareness that that's something that's available to them. And so we have to do a tremendous amount of marketing internally. And when people are so busy with their client projects, they just don't really feel like they've got the time to spend learning about some new service that another part of the organization may be offering.
Touch points, repetition. In this day and age, one time isn't going to stick. You got to keep at it. So it makes sense that you're constantly evangelizing.
Yeah, and we've had significant, mostly organic growth over the past 3 years, and I think that there's some statistic, I will get it a little bit wrong, but I think 40% of our organization has been in the company less than 2 years. And so if we feel like, well, I told that person 2 years ago, well, you told 60% of our employees 2 years ago. So what about the other 40%, right? So, it's just recognizing that when you've got growth, the fact that you told somebody something a year and a half ago, or that, yeah, we had a webinar on that, and you look back at the time, and I know for me, time flies. I think, oh yeah, I did that last month, and I go back and look, and it was in February. I'm like, oh, I guess it wasn't last month. It seems like it was last month, and maybe that speaks to my age, but it just sort of things seem to be moving so rapidly that I think we underestimate the amount of folks who've joined or the amount of folks who haven't gotten the message for one reason or another.
I have, it ties back into the last response, but I've had a lot of my executive leadership group come to me with the same response. We don't have budget. Now this doesn't sound the same from every company. Like if you're born a technology company, obviously it's a technology company, but inherently a lot of the chief financial officers and the chief technology officers seem to have some sort of rivalry going on for budget. Is this really an uphill battle, and how do you address some of these challenges that ultimately would gatekeep you from innovation or existing infrastructure?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that one of the things that we do very well at SWCA is that there's the kind of the overhead budget, right, is managed really very well, but that doesn't mean that anybody's really in my business and looking at what our expenses were on a month-to-month or week-to-week basis, right? And when we prepare our annual budgets, I have a number, right, and I find a way to get to that number, but nobody's questioning whether or not it's appropriate for me to spend, $6,000 on a meeting to get all of my leaders together, in March, right? Nobody's going to question something that is in the minutia like that, or whether or not, we should be using a Gartner or somebody like that, because the price of those kinds of services appears high. The value, in my opinion, that you get if you leverage them appropriately is much higher than the cost. And so I look at some of those things as investments, but explaining that to some other folks can be difficult. So I think that in other organizations I've been, there's certainly conflict, I would say, between the CFO and the CIO or the CTO in terms of, just wanting to make sure that that number is as low as possible. And, when you are also trying to do as much as possible around new product development, innovation, you're getting asked those questions. You have to have some money whether it's set aside or not, but you've got to have some time, which equates to money, to be looking at those things. Maybe that is a few extra headcount in a small group. It doesn't matter. Or maybe it's, that you have a group of folks that are expected to spend 10% of their time on new product development. But you got to have some way that people know that they have time to be looking at the new things versus just trying to, as I said, keep things alive and make sure we don't have breaches. So you've got to have some numbers there. You've got to have some way that you're funding that.
Yeah, the CFOs tend to understand operationally how a business works, right? But technically, no. And I see that how that could pose challenges. Cool.
Yeah. One of the ways we do that too is that we get revenue from some of the technology services from our clients, and so we that goes in to fund some of the other work that we do around not just supporting those services, but looking at new things.
So to that point, Linda, you mentioned allocating time to focus on what might be next, but as we've established, this landscape changes by the second. How do you keep your finger on the pulse of something that's constantly changing? I'm not sure how large your team is, but it sounds like a portion of time is dedicated to that pursuit. But are there other resources that you leverage to keep up to speed on the latest and the greatest?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I always feel like there's one more article I should read, right? And so, or one more, trade where I should be looking at. I look at a wide variety of things. I think it's important if you always kind of have, I'm in some ways I'm kind of old school, right? And I probably read, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People 30 years ago. And you think about that whole notion of sharpening the saw that whole series from Franklin Covey talked about. I think it's pretty similar, right? That you've got to if you constantly have your nose to the grindstone, so to speak, and you're not taking a break and looking up and sharpening your tools, sharpening your saw, it's just going to take longer. And you got to take that rest and look around and see what's happening. And I think, I do that because I belong to a few different, kind of industry organizations, and in the architecture, engineering, consulting industry, there's a group, the consulting group that sponsors an annual, technology conference, and they publish articles about what's going on in technology in AEC. I try to keep aware of those things. I use an organization called Infotech Research Group, which is a smaller competitor to Gartner and Forrester. I try to pop in on their website once a week and try to see what's the new stuff they're publishing. I read not just sort of things like CIO.com, but I'll show I have sitting on my piece here that I've had sitting here for probably a year is Harvard Business Review. In an article, they now seem to be having pretty frequent articles about artificial intelligence and just sort of where companies should be leveraging that. So I'm constantly looking at things ranging from, business management and leadership, to diversity, equity, and inclusion, groups. I happen to live in the San Diego metropolitan area, and there's a group here called Athena that is a STEM women's organization that advocates for women learning, whether it's life sciences or technology, um, you know, and doing much more professional development there. So I am always kind of looking around the landscape. I also happen to be um, a board director for a small cybersecurity firm in Boulder, Colorado, called Rule 4. And so on that end of my life, I recently completed a board certification for employee-owned firms. There's a lot of pieces, right? There's that I'm always drawing from. I'm drawing from my experience in technology, but also as somebody who's worked for employee-owned firms for the better part of the last 25 years, and thinking about what I thought about things as an employee versus as a leader versus as a board member. But I kind of draw from a lot of different aspects of my life.
I mean, that's a breath of fresh air for me to hear. I see a lot of knee jerk Gartner, comments, and Gartner 20 years ago, when technology wasn't complicated or didn't have its nuances, kind of a ubiquitous description was fine. Now it's latency. Now it's on ramps. I mean, it's just so many things, right? And Gartner doesn't do a very good job of being agile and bringing those kind of nuances into the mix. So to hear you're doing all those things is really interesting, and I think people out there should be listening.
Well, thank you. I think, the other piece, and I don't mean to bag on Gartner, but I think that, a lot of those organizations struggle with who their client is. Is their client the vendor of the solution? Is their client the CIO or the CTO of a Fortune 500 company, or is their client the CIO or the CTO of a 500 person firm, right? And when you are making recommendations to a CIO, it absolutely matters whether or not they have, what their budget is and what the percentage of their revenue they're expected to spend is. And my industry sits on the lower end of that, right? And I have spoken to CIOs at banks, and they get like 15% of their net revenue to spend on technology, and I get way less than that. It's a fraction of that. And it's not. I'm not saying it should be different, but it's I literally had some of those bigger, I'll just say bigger advisory groups tell me they don't know how we do it in small organizations. I don't know how you do it when you got 2,000 employees and you got 40 people in IT. I just don't get it. So there's absolutely a difference there, and I think you need to kind of shop for which advisory group understands either your industry or your part of the market best, because they're not all the same.
Tapping into your community, your network is highly beneficial. We have many clients at Upstack come to us and say, I got a lot on my plate, understandably so. Can you just help keep me up to speed on the latest and the greatest? And that's one of the many roles we play, and other third-party advisors can certainly play. So shout out for the advisors out there. Linda, you did mention AI. I believe that's the second mention of AI in this podcast. I think I touched on it at the top. We lasted almost 40 minutes, so good on us. But let's maybe we set it aside just for a moment, 'cause I'm very curious. What emerging technologies are you tapping into to drive SWCA forward at the moment? And what led you to leveraging those solutions in the first place?
Yeah. I think that's a good question. I think that we're certainly leveraging AI. We have a great, talented, small but mighty team working on those solutions, both for our employees and for our clients to leverage. And so we have our own internal chatbot at SWCA now that we use, so that we can make sure that that our data is our data and it's not getting out there, and being kind of we aren't entering a paper into an OpenAI product and asking it to help us with the writing, which I know some of our competitors are doing. And then that data becomes, kind of the property of OpenAI. Right? Data is now currency, and I think that there's a lot there we have to keep our eye on from a security perspective, and that's where that kind of balance is really important, because we have a lot of people coming at us and saying, we got to leverage this, we got to leverage this, we got to leverage this. And we're like, yep, we do. And we have to do it safely and securely and keep our data our data. So there's ways we have to balance those kinds of things. Certainly, artificial intelligence is something we've been working on a long time. The LLMs or large language models and the text capabilities is, I'll say, relatively new now. I guess it's a year and a half out, something like that, in terms of when ChatGPT was launched. Absolutely, there's ways we want to leverage that and ways we do use that. I mentioned satellite data previously. We're leveraging that a lot. We use a tremendous amount of geospatial data because of the nature of our work. We have some of the best folks at merging those two worlds in what we call GeoAI on our team. Really the number one vendor in the US for geospatial software is a company called ESRI. ESRI has kind of told us that we have a scientist named Josh Bailey, and Josh is on my team, and he's done amazing stuff around GeoAI that nobody else is doing. And so that's really important for us to look at, sort of where do we use AI and how do we use it, and what's the benefit of it, and making sure that we also leverage it in a manner where we recognize that something like ChatGPT isn't an expert. It's more like an intern that's got a tremendous amount of time and can type really fast. But we have to go back and QA the information it gives us. Right? It's going to have errors. It's going to hallucinate sometimes. It's going to just give you the wrong answer once in a while, and you've got to be able to spot those kinds of things.
If it's must be a college intern if it's hallucinating at times.
Well, I wasn't going to go there, but yeah. So
Safe space, Upstack podcast. I love the personification of AI in that way. So you touched on the elephant in the room. Have you found when it comes to AI, and because you are a consultancy at SWCA, clients coming to you and saying, what should our AI strategy be? We must have one. We have those conversations. We welcome those conversations, but it doesn't necessarily apply to every business or industry in a meaningful way. So we call it the hype cycle, right, Greg? Yeah. Got to be aware of the hype cycle. But curious if I'm sure you're having those conversations with clients, and maybe those are becoming more frequent conversations.
We are having those conversations. I think that it's probably less of the, what should our AI strategy be, but more of the where can SWCA leverage AI and the work that they do for us, and are you keeping but the flip side of that is, I want to make sure our data is safe. So we do have some clients who have asked us not to use it, and so it's always balanced, right? You can't create a policy for one client and realize that that's going to impact other clients. There's clients on both sides of that either really want you to use it because it's more efficient and they feel like you're going to give a better answer, and there's clients who are like, nope, I do not want that anywhere near my project. So being able to have that agility and flexibility to manage both kinds of clients and have the infrastructure in place for both options is important.
Interesting. So at times you're playing that sounding board role, but also at other times maybe back to putting the evangelist hat on, where there could be clients who would really benefit from embracing AI. Oh, everything is a balance.
I just wanted to add on to the AI conversation. We've noticed in the industry 3 major pillars, right? AI for profit, AI for indirect value, whether it's saving time, and then obviously as a barrier to entry. Are you capitalizing on all three of those pillars, or are you focused more on one?
I think I would say it's probably all three pillars. I mean, there's not one piece where you look at AI. I think that we see that there's certainly efficiencies out there in terms of, you know, gathering information from, regulatory websites and things like that, right? That would just take us a tremendous amount of time if we did that by hand. Um, but I think that there's certainly efficiencies and productivity gains there. I think that there's also a piece where there's if you leverage insights, and I was talking about this morning, in fact, that um, not with language models per se, but with predictive modeling in AI, there's probably some financial insights you can gain with use of AI in some of those pieces um, that would be that would help us from a competitive standpoint. I was at a board meeting recently, and one of the board members asked us in terms of AI and cybersecurity, like, won't this help us? Like, shouldn't we be able to do, cybersecurity easier, faster, better, cheaper? And it was like, well, yes, and the bad guys are using it too to create new threats. So AI, in terms of cybersecurity, means it's becoming, and actually it always has been, but it's exacerbating the arms race of cybersecurity. It's another tool, another weapon, if you will, and everybody's got to have it, right? So the tools that you have that you use to prevent, threats are needed to be. I need that now use AI, but that's because the threats out there are using AI to write them. So,
Linda, how have you integrated third-party expertise into your approach?
there's a few different ways that over my uh, career I've learned kind of where those fit. I think one of them is, as I mentioned before, we do it as a way we talk to people, right? Whether it's people we've worked with in the past, as coworkers, and maybe now we're not coworkers anymore, but we still have respect for what somebody knows and looks at and does. And so I think we leverage people from that perspective on an informal basis. We have our partners like Upstack who we know are experts, and we see um, them as an extension of our team in many ways. Um, there's a similar relationship we have with one individual. We sort of aren't big enough to have a network architect yet. But we have complex needs, and so like for some roles like that, right, we don't have a network architect on staff, but we have a relationship with a trusted third party who we use as a consultant, who again is really seen as kind of an extension of our team and is there when we need them. So it's really important to find those folks, to continue those relationships and to know where they play, and then also to make sure that those relationships aren't just with you, but they're with your team, and that they know who the players are and what their role is and what the expectations are.
Gang, is there anything we haven't covered before we wrap up here?
I feel like I'm smarter.
It's why I want to create this podcast. I needed to up my game, so I too feel smarter. Linda, anything to add?
I don't think so. It's been fun. Thanks for giving me some time and voice today.
This has been fun. Thank you again for joining us. Here we are. We've gone inside the mind of the CTO. And to Greg's point, we are a little bit smarter. Linda, we appreciate it. Listeners, thank you as always for following along with us. Greg Moss, couldn't do without you.
Thank you, guys.
This has been another episode of the Upstack Podcast. We will see you next time.